It's so important that you have quality education in your schools, and to not only for the girls but for the boys, to learn from a young age about gender equality as a whole. Right? If you learn about it in school, you normalize it. It's not something that's foreign to you when you're older, and that's changing generations as you go. And so it's learning about your sexual and reproductive health at a young age, and not stigmatizing it where girls can't go to school at certain times of the month. So it's important for them to learn about it then, and boys, and to engage boys in the conversation as feminists themselves and understand what that means. It's vitally important.
Welcome to the Mitti Ke Rang podcast, Jessica. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I am doing great, and I'm so glad to have you on the podcast and discuss issues that are currently prevailing in the country and I believe throughout the world. So, I would like to start the podcast by asking you, how did you decide that something women's issues or rather human rights is something you want to work on and you want to advocate for the same and continue working on these?
Yeah. So I actually started out in the human rights realm. I really was interested in researching about mass atrocity crimes and genocide, because these crimes were absolutely horrific. And in studying them, you realize that they're completely preventable. And so you had to ask yourself why countries weren't doing more. If they had, the indicators that these crimes are going to take place, why weren't they doing more to prevent them? And I found that in learning about this work, that there were very specific gendered aspects to some of the crimes that were happening. So, for example, women wouldn't be targeted just to be killed, but they would be specifically targeted for crimes. For example, their genitalia would be mutilated. And that was to create a stigma, a long-lasting stigma in that community, that if any of the men that survived, that came back, they wouldn't be able to rebuild. So the very gendered natures of these crimes really were very interesting to me. This was kind of a new area that was emerging from some of the tribunals that were coming out of Rwanda and Yugoslavia. And so I decided then that I wanted to learn more about the gender equality world, and I got more involved in learning about violence against women and domestic violence and women's political participation, and got really intrigued in trying to get women to the decision-making table where it all happens. Because we know that, when women are at the decision-making table during peace negotiations, that the agreements are 35% more likely to last at least 15 years if women are involved in the creation of these negotiations. So all of this to say that this was why I got involved and why it still is my passion.
You being involved in researching about the issues for a long time and having experience in the same. So there are many issues that are embedded so deep in our everyday life that we sometimes fail to even recognize them. So how do you think an individual like me or you should bring up the conversation, or how do you think we can recognize those and address those?
Yeah. So I'll use two examples. So women and girls' lives are shaped when they're young, right? When they're girls. And research shows that a girl's confidence actually peaks at the age of 9. So before she even gets into the double digits, right? And boys' confidence actually takes off at that age. And so you have to wonder why that is, right? So we think about the way that girls are portrayed in the media. We have to look a certain way. We have to act a certain way. And that's discouraging. We start to see ourselves more as, the model rather than the powerful CEO that the boys are being taught. So addressing that at a young age, addressing how we perceive ourselves in the media, whether it be a TV show that we're watching or a movie, or how we see ourselves in our community. And from a young age, if we want to get involved in activism at that point, we have to change it then. So that way that when girls grow up, they see themselves in these other positions, whether that be running for president or running as CEO, for example. And then the other thing that they would also need is role models, right? They need to see a girl or a woman that's in that position so they know what they can aspire to. Which is why I'm involved in this new organization called Zahara's Dream, which provides that for young women. So it connects them with an older mentor to give that advice so that they can achieve their own goals and their own careers. So that's one aspect of it. And then the other thing that I would look at recognizing and changing is seeing women as leaders themselves. The OECD actually reported last year that 47% of the world's population believes that men will make better political leaders than women, which is crazy to think about, because now we see with COVID-19 that the women leaders are actually doing better.
Absolutely.
They have less cases, less people are dying, and you have to wonder why. And that's because women are changing what we see as leadership, right? They're more willing to listen to the experts and putting their egos aside. They acted faster. And not only that, they respond with empathy and compassion, something that we don't normally see and associate with the male leaders, right? So how do we change that? How do we see women as leaders? We have to start in our communities. We have to change the hearts and minds of the people that are around us. And then we also can do things institutionally in our systems, right? We can do quotas to get women there. So that way we see them. And you can see that with the US elections. When Hillary Clinton ran, she was one woman. And people would say, well, I don't know if she's the right woman. And it was a different conversation. But now with the current elections, this last time in the primaries, we saw several different women. And then they started asking questions about, well, what's her policy? Or what does she think about this? So it was a very completely different conversation. So those are two things that I would say.
Absolutely. I think that totally makes sense, and we do need to change our approach, the way we see way we see women leaders. And instead of having the conversation, are they fit for running? We should have the conversation, like you said, what are the policies and the things they're willing to work on.
Mm-hmm.
So another piece of news that I read a couple of weeks ago, which was due to the COVID-19 situation and the lockdown being imposed for now more than 4 or 5 months in India. So we're all at home since 4 or 5 months. And the point, we have come to a point where we are now seeing online, people are now going online more, and they're searching for different stuff. But something that has increased is violence with women, or not just women. We're seeing labor rights being exploited. So what do you think the state should, how do you think the state should react to this, and what are the possible solutions that we as an individual can also come up with?
Mm-hmm. So even before COVID-19 hit, we knew that 1 in 3 women worldwide would be subjected to physical or sexual violence. So it was already a problem. And that was in the last 12 months, we know that 243 million women have been subjected to violence. And so with COVID, that number is likely to double, which is just staggering to think about. The news has actually described this as women and girls facing a double pandemic, or a shadow pandemic. And that meaning they can't go out into their communities and be outside because they need to protect themselves against COVID. But then their home life is almost more dangerous in staying in the house. So we know that also with COVID, how we know that it's increasing is because the hotlines are increasing significantly. I know that in France, the number of calls coming into hotlines increased by 25%, and in Singapore, it was 30%. So knowing all of these things, there are different things that you can do to help change the situation for women and girls at home, both as individuals and both for the government. So for the government, not only do they have the financial reason to actually respond, we know that violence against women and girls costs the global economy $1.5 trillion. So not only do they have the financial incentive to respond, but they also need to for their citizens as part of their human rights. So governments need to, most importantly, strengthen the services that exist for women who are experiencing violence in their homes as a result of COVID. And that means expanding the capacity of shelters, because a lot of shelters are full. And that can mean using hotels that aren't being used for rooms for women to go to. They need to provide more funding for these services, and they need to strengthen the helplines. And even though we know these helplines are, overwhelmed with the calls, we also know a lot of women can't actually call in because they have their perpetrator in the home. So just thinking about all these things, thinking about how communities can respond. So in some countries, pharmacies, for example, have taken on safe words. So if a woman comes into the pharmacy, she can say a word and they'll help. And then as individuals, we can recognize some of the signs. So in South Africa, for example, they ran a campaign for their citizens about how to recognize and respond and to call this in if they were worried about someone, that their neighbor, of something they heard, something they saw. So it's important that we all work together to address this, because it is a significant problem, especially during COVID.
Absolutely. Being a great ally and or just being an active citizen would definitely help a lot. I believe in calling and asking how our mates or how the people acquaintances are doing, and just knowing what's going with them, what's going on with them, what's going on in their life. This would help too.
Yeah. And it's not just, when we think about violence, it's not just physical or sexual or something that you can actually see, right? It can be financial abuse, where they can't leave because they don't have access to their money, or it can be online abuse, right? That's skyrocketing with people being engaged online. It can be harassment. So emotional, I mean, there's so many different forms. So it's just important to recognize that. And as you said, check in on your friends and your family to kind of look for some of these signs.
Right. So something which also comes up in my mind while talking about this is how do we become very responsible and active citizens of the internet, of what we are searching, of what is trending, and how to just be cautious of what we're watching online.
Mm-hmm. So online violence against women has really skyrocketed during COVID because we're so much more engaged online. And there are many forms that it takes. It can be physical threats, it can be sexual harassment, stalking, Zoom bombing, sex trolling. I mean, the possibilities are endless. And they can be, intersectional in that it can be racially charged, or it can be targeting a very specific age group. So it really, like children and child pornography, and then the increase in that area. So it's important to recognize some of these areas, and also the motivations behind them. I know that politically active women are targeted because of their activism, and to try to get them to be quiet and to get offline, right? So it's important to know the motivations behind each of these crimes. But how do we kind of respond to these issues? It's really about governments working with technology companies to be able to recognize and respond effectively to these crimes. So for example, in the UK, Amnesty International did a report looking at harassment against politically active women and the forms that it took. And I mean, it was staggering, the rates that were happening. And the UK government was taking steps to make tighter regulations for companies to respond. So it's doing that all over the world and holding them accountable if it's their platforms, to be able to protect women and girls online. And I can tell you, it's happened to me too. In the middle of doing all of these webinars, I was a part of one where we had pornographic images that were sent across, and derogatory language that was used, and we had to end the meeting. There was nothing we could do. So it is happening.
Right. So like, again, for example, if that happens in like a platform you're talking about, how do we react to that? What do we do post that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that most organizations now, it was a learning process for everybody to understand how Zoom works, right? So now they're requiring passwords to be able to have these meetings so that it's better protected. So it's really important, first of all, to make the spaces that you have as protected as possible. But if something like that does happen, it's important to have a plan of what you're going to do. So, you know, if you're organizing a webinar, for example, have a plan that if it gets Zoom bombed, for example, of what you're going to do. Are you going to end the meeting and then reschedule? Are you going to immediately send another link for people to reconnect? You know, it's important to have kind of these plans on standby, but I wouldn't give these people any time of the day myself. And you know, don't let it hurt your activism. Like it's not worth it.
Absolutely, I agree. So, apart from this, something else I believe that needs conversation and attention is talking about gender sensitization programs in schools and inculcating something like that from a young age to build better citizens with responsibility. So, how do you think building gender sensitization programs or other programs like these would help shape students at a very young age?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, this is coming back to what I was talking about earlier about shaping them when girls are young. It's so important that you have quality education in your schools, and to not only for the girls but for the boys, to learn from a young age about gender equality as a whole. Right? If you learn about it in school, you normalize it. It's not something that's foreign to you when you're older, and that's changing generations as you go. And so it's learning about, you know, your sexual and reproductive health at a young age and not stigmatizing it where girls can't go to school at certain times of the month, you know. So it's important for them to learn about it then, and boys, and to engage boys in the conversation as feminists themselves and understand what that means. Yeah, it's vitally important.
Right. So there was a study which I read again a couple of weeks ago. So a study by World Economic Forum in November last year, which said that it will take about 100 years or more to fill the gender pay gap. So how do you, this was very surprising for me because I did know gender pay gap existed, but to such an extent for me to believe it was astonishing to read that. So, how do you think the state should react to that? What are the possible measures that the state should take and the organizations or companies themselves should work on?
Yeah, the global gender pay gap is a real problem. We know that depending on the country, it ranges from 16 to 22% of women making less than men, which is crazy for the same job, right? You have to ask yourself why that is. They actually calculated how much wealth is lost just from women not earning as much, and that's $160.2 trillion. That's double the global GDP right now, just for women not making as much. And so you have to ask yourself why that is, right? And some of the issues, for example, are that women take maternity leave if they can, right? And that's because there's no paternity leave that exists. Fathers may not be able to financially stay at home for another 6 weeks, or their work environment may have a stigma attached to it where fathers don't socially do it. But like in the Nordic countries where they do offer paternity leave, they have a more gender equal society. So we know that it's important and there's benefits for the children and for the mother and for the father from fathers taking paternity leave. So that's one aspect of it. And with women taking it, you know, they're less likely to get promoted. Maybe they take a year or two off. So that hurts their economic empowerment in that way. Another issue is that women do 3 times much as unpaid care work than men. And that's doing chores, taking care of the children, taking care of the elderly in their homes. And so that takes up a lot of their time, a lot of their, you know, time that they could be doing as work to get them promoted, right? So all of these factors go into the gender pay gap. So it's addressing those. So like with unpaid care, making work flexible, making those hours flexible for women to be able to do these things, and demanding that men also take their fair share of the unpaid care leave so that both have the opportunity in their careers to succeed.
Right. It was really sad for me to know how the domestic responsibilities or the domestic work that women do are so negatively associated with the profession.
Yeah, and COVID's making it again.
Absolutely.
Way worse.
Right. So, talking about the same thing, how should for example, I'm a woman who facing such comments in the workplace, not getting a specific project because someone's about to be a mom or is about to be married. So, how do an individual react to that? What's the process to go about it?
Mm-hmm. So, what I have found was really effective is to stand in solidarity with your other female coworkers, right? So if you go into a meeting and you say something and another man mansplains, right? Says what you says in a different way, but because he's a man, he gets heard by your boss. If he does that, if your female coworker, for example, beside you, sees it, hears it, she can re-echo what you just said and say, oh yeah, that was a fair point by her, right? It's standing in solidarity with each other and helping each other to really address some of those gender biases in the workplace. And it's the same with harassment. I mean, the workplace has to have these policies in place. They have to have the protocols in which you respond, and the employer needs to actually hold those accountable and have zero tolerance for it. So it's the policies and it's the social life within that workplace that has to go hand in hand. And as an individual, like I said, you have to be the change that you want to see. You have to stand up against what you see as wrong and what you believe in. And that's why we see the social movements that are happening right now, because people are fed up. Whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's the Me Too movement, whether it's the climate change movement. I mean, you have to get involved in what you believe in, and you have to stand up for that.
Absolutely. In fact, I was reading this very beautiful piece of article which said it's no more a movement, it's now more of a revolution, because people have had it up till here, they cannot take it anymore.
Yeah.
So, how can an individual behave, again boiling down to individual, how can we behave or how can we react or just give our response in our everyday life to achieve a inequality free world? Like how do we react to these small issues that take place every day? How do we become better versions of ourselves?
Yeah, well, the most important thing is you have to constantly educate yourself, right? Because we all come with our own biases to the table. And so learning about that so that you're able to acknowledge and respond in those situations is key. So for example, if you're walking down the street and you get catcalled by someone, you know, you need to have thought about how you're going to respond to that. Also, like educating other people. If you have a friend and you see it, call it out. Educate that person on why it is what they're doing is wrong. I know that, for example, with the catcall example, if you have a male friend and you get catcalled, you would hope your male friend would also stand up for you and saying, hey, that's not right, don't do that. You know, it's having those conversations, and sometimes they're very tough conversations, but that's how we move the needle for gender equality.
Absolutely. They are indeed tough conversations. We might have to lose a few friends in the process, but I can guarantee we'll never lose the right ones. The only ones those will understand and talk to you about the right things will be the ones that are worth it.
Yep.
So I have these two questions for you before ending the podcast. So one of which is, what is the best advice you've ever got, be it in your personal life or your professional life? that you would like to share by summing up into a 5 to 7 word presentation title?
So the best advice in a 5 to 7 word presentation is, if you are comfortable, you aren't growing. You constantly have to get out of your shell and make yourself uncomfortable, whether that's doing a podcast or, being active in your community and protesting with the sign, whatever it is, going for a promotion at work, putting yourself out there. If you really want to grow as an individual, whether it be in your individual life, personal life, your professional life, your social life, whatever it may be, you have to step out of your comfort zone.
Absolutely. There's no room for growth in your comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
And what is the message or a piece of advice that you would like to give to all the listeners of the podcast?
Mm-hmm. So there's two things. Maya Angelou actually has one of my favorite quotes of all times. She says, if you're always trying to be normal, you will never know how amazing you can be. So if you're always trying to be like everybody else and conform to what society's telling you to be, you'll never achieve your full potential. You need to be who you are and really embrace that. And because that's powerfully you. That's Zahara's dream, that mentor program I was telling you about. So that's one aspect of it. And then the other thing, which I kind of alluded to earlier, is we rise by lifting others. We have to lift each other up, especially as women. We have to stand in solidarity with each other. We're all going on the same train in the same direction. So if we really want to make impactful change, we have to do it together.
Absolutely. That's a beautiful message that you put out there. And thank you for being with us today and having this conversation that people really need to listen to. And just by educating themselves, I believe you're doing our duty here. Thank you for the time.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you so much.